I'm really delighted to be here today with Jessie and Stuart, so I'm going to do some very short biographies. I'm sorry to say that Katrina Simon, who is part of the curatorium for this show, is unable to join us today. She's unfortunately ill, but just to acknowledge Katrina and also Naomi Stead and Linda Steele, who are the co-curators of this exhibition, and RMIT Culture, who produced the exhibition with us. So Stuart Geddes is a graphic designer working mostly with books. He's a lecturer, researcher and a PhD candidate at RMIT University and has worked with us integrally over the years, but particularly on this show. And Jessie French is an artist who navigates the intersection of art, ecology and technology amidst the climate crisis. Pioneering in the realm of sustainable plastics, Jessie explores consumption, symbiosis and sustainability. So today's conversation is going to be very much focused on the making of Wild Hope and thinking about the kind of process that we went through in terms of making this exhibition. We are also going to touch on some key works in the show that relate to the making, and I think we're going to wrap up at around about the 45-minute mark in terms of the more formal gathering here, but also invite you to come with us into the other gallery and to do an informal walk around with some of those works. So one of the things that I think is really important to acknowledge with the making of Wild Hope, it is the start of something. It's actually an exhibition that, if you like, is the start of a greater research project called Planetary. And this is a collaboration with Indy Joha of Dark Matter Labs. And we had the great fortune of having Indy here with us to launch not only the exhibition, but to do a fantastic keynote at the Capitol. So I think this really folds into some of the ideas, how exhibition making in a space like Design Hub Gallery can actually formulate and start the beginnings of things and to translate works in progress to public audiences rather than to be the kind of culmination of something. And the exhibition really is a way of embracing and advocating towards this movement of a planetary commons. And it really is about demonstrating new approaches and alliances between researchers. So in that way, it is a group exhibition. One of our artists, Joel Stuart, described it to me a bit like a mini biennale, and I think that was a really lovely way of reflecting on it. In many respects, it's about scooping up a lot of the research works that are happening both across the university, but importantly, further afield with artists like Jessie and other creative practitioners in our community, and really understanding those works and mediating them to a public audience. Of course, we did set ourselves the agenda of trying to make this exhibition in, we called it a kind of light footprint. We were very sensitive to that, but I think it's really important that we're explicit too about the challenges within that. So there were lots of opportunities. So for example, we didn't have lots of issues like freight. We were able to reuse lots of existing materials, and in many respects we were working with work that was being made in process or we could activate to be made as part of this exhibition. Of course, we were working with challenges too. It was labour intensive. We had a very short development time of really only a few months to make the exhibition. So they were all challenges that we had to work within in that context. So I think, without further ado, let's get into it. And Jessie, I think I'd like to start with you, if I can. And just to kind of set the scene a little bit, Jessie, we approached Jessie as an invited contributor to the show, and she came on board straight away with much enthusiasm. And you can see here that we have these wonderful algae paintings by Jessie, and Jessie will talk more to that in a moment. But one of the other aspects of working with Jessie was bringing her right into the exhibition making itself, and the opportunity to really use the signage, the wayfinding and the graphic development as a way of testing this algae material in the place of vinyl plastics. which are obviously used so often in exhibition making and galleries, but also in retail environments, etc. So this was a really wonderful way to upscale those ideas. So Jessie, I think it would be great to start at the beginning and to learn a little bit more about the algae material, where it comes from, how it's harvested, how you work with it. Tell us a bit more about that.
So I guess my practice started with the issue that we have with plastics. I have a history of working in the arts, and I had a previous, a whole kind of career working in the arts, and that's how I've come to know these two before I got here. But what motivated me to start doing this was, I guess, the overwhelming issue that we have with a lot of materials that we use, and particularly petrochemical plastics. The link to algae is inherent there because when we're talking about petrochemicals, they are a fossil of algae that's been compressed and aged for millions of years under very specific conditions. But what we're actually dealing with here is a new algae. So I spent the beginning of 2020, before I had to come home, in Morocco, which is where most of the world's agar comes from. And agar, you might know it if you've worked in a lab. It's usually at the bottom of petri dishes. If you're in the kitchen a lot, you might have come across it as like a vegan alternative to gelatin. But it has a gelifying property. And that is also the beginning of some long chain molecular repeating kind of chains of molecules which are polymers. And when you form polymers into something that is a thing, it's called a plastic, and it has a mechanical property where it can be molded. And we lose sight of that when we talk about plastics, because often we just think about petrochemical plastics, but it's really just the term for a material that can be molded. So that's where it started. Where should I go next?
Well, I think it would be fantastic to maybe bring Stuart into conversation with you in terms of how, when I first came to your studio and we were looking at the works that might be available for the exhibition, Jessie showed me a test in her studio, which was very small scale, but a test of cut lettering in the place of vinyl. And that kind of sparked this idea, how might we, in a space like Design Hub, which in some ways is about testing ideas and allowing them sometimes to even fail, that frightening word, how might we kind of test this in the exhibition itself? So there was lots of discussion between Stuart at that point in terms of how we might work with this material, how we might approach it, how we might test it, and I guess mitigate the fact that there were certain constraints around it. So, Stuart, do you want to talk to that process a little bit and how you work together?
Sure. Hi. Thanks. I get, I was, because I'd been aware of Jessie, of this work, and also the vessels and things that Jessie had been making for a while. But then seeing the idea of this, I guess one of the things that I kind of really that seemed really like a great opportunity and really inspiring kind of thing at the beginning of this for me was to see how Jessie was had been going from this kind of really weird, interesting kind of science and art kind of crossover kind of space, but also really blurring the lines of a practice between art and science and design, and then also through the vinyl into potentially like a production manufacturing kind of thing, but that was in the early stages of kind of prototyping. And so I saw this this test that Jessie has stuck on the glass door in the studio. There's a beautiful photo of it that's Jessie pointing at touching this material, and it's like a word material, cut in this vinyl made out of this material. It's really lovely. And I think very very early on there were these ideas bouncing around of minimizing waste of reusing on the one hand, and then also incorporating this new material, which is renewable in a kind of different way to the kind of reuse that you sort of see in these panels that we'll talk about later. But I think like one of the very early ideas of how we might use the material in the kind of graphic design of the show is to kind of combine those ideas and use the entire, like try to use entire sheets, partly to, even though that wasn't strictly required, because in Jessie's work the material is totally renewable. You can boil it down and remake it again. But we had a few discussions of how much we wanted, because also Jessie's working on versions of the material that look much more like vinyl. Like, so there's a white sheet and a black sheet, and it's smoother and, you know, like really readily replaceable like option for the kind of vinyl that's used in shops and in exhibitions. And we kind of talked about wanting to use a material that's sort of like had a bit more of its organic algae personality.
And it's fascinating, Jessie, to talk through, and when we're in the studio with you, for you to show us how the material is made. And for example, this timber panel that we can see up here, right above us, you talk about making a kind of timber tea when you're making that particular work. Can you talk a little bit about how a specific one like that is made?
Yeah, so that one, this one that we're pointing out, just so everyone knows which one, it's the one with the uneven bottom. And it was actually made with the wood shavings from a furniture maker down here. So Craft Victoria actually put me in touch with him and proposed that I use the kind of byproducts of another craftsperson's studio. So Thomas Lentini is a beautiful furniture maker. So he had a lot of really, really beautiful wood shavings. And for him, when he saw this piece, he was really, really touched, because he kind of looked at me and said, these are absolutely phenomenal timbers, and the amount of, you know, shavings, like I said, can you bring me some? And I thought there would be a box, but it was two giant garbage bags. Like, thank God I've got a trolley. But and, you know, he was kind of like, look, you know, this is just, I have to throw it out. There's nothing I can really do with it. But so what happens with the pigment from a timber is that it has tannins in it, which you might know from wine or from tea. Plants have tannins in them, and they leach out a colour. And there's some other things in it that can give it some colour. There's some flavonoids, and there's also some chlorophyll, which will fade. But the main colour you're getting is a tannin. And this has got a lot of oak, so it smelt absolutely beautiful when it was being kind of cooked. But yeah, that was a process of essentially just boiling up these wood shavings and filtering them out.
And I think, again, it's really helpful to share the moments of challenge and when we had to kind of navigate those. So we did have originally one of the timber panels that was cut for one of the opening panels, and because of its almost like fruit leathery type of texture, which is so extraordinary, it literally it was alive on the wall. It was kind of moving and bubbling and unfolding, and so there's always that tension of do we just leave it and let it behave and peel off and bubble, and we accept that that's part of the character, or do we need to replace it because it's perhaps going to fail to a degree where people won't get to enjoy it? So those points of tension are always really interesting when you're working with these more experimental processes. You've got a certain duration that you need to work within, but also allowing people to understand that this is an exploratory thing. So Stuart, do you want to talk a little bit about that in terms of how we met some of those challenges? And perhaps it leads into a discussion about the didactic panels as well, because originally we did envisage they might be in algae, but we moved to found materials.
Yeah, sure. There's a few things there. I guess there were quite a few moments during the design of the show where we had to shift course, and it was because of the nature of this kind of really emerging exhibition and the ambitions for it and the unknown of a lot of the materials, like the algae to a certain extent, but also this use of kind of found materials. And I think, that's just a really exciting prospect, I think, of, it's with Jessie's material in particular, like being able to work with it at this super early kind of prototype stage as it's kind of heading into, the next stages of kind of development. Being able to be involved in the kind of, in that testing and coming up with questions more than anything, whether one of the panels not adhering as well as another, did that have to do with the tannin, or was it the thinness, or was it the
it answered questions for me as well, because what happened with that sheet is that it had some of the sawdust still included, because we were trying to put a little bit more organic personality, but it's about working out, and in that process, I can answer questions as well, because for me, the mechanical property of it is that the material absorbs moisture. That gives it the ability to be recycled in water at the end, but it also means that it will change with humidity. But when you have sawdust in it, that also acts as a bit of a sink for the humidity, and so that's why we got the the changes in the topography of the sheet, which is not so great for sticking a huge sheet of it on the wall flat.
Yeah, and so actually that intention to kind of show these big sheets was actually kind of working mechanically against the material. So Yeah.
And it has become a bit of a ritual in the morning, this kind of quite beautiful caring for these sheets as the exhibition's opening. In fact, Lisa from the design culture team RMIT culture team was just here earlier smoothing out very carefully the panel. So this kind of idea of care for the materials themselves is really important. Certainly there were discussions around, as I spoke earlier, this kind of almost biennale approach, this scooping up of live research works as well as some invited works was challenging in a very short time frame to think about allowing each work to have its own voice in relationship to this kind of overarching theme, to bring out those stories of hope. And the title is quite intentional. I mean, these are, serious issues to grapple with, and a radical shift towards this idea of a planetary commons. And Indy spoke so eloquently, but also, with such urgency about that at the Capitol the other night. But also we were very aware that the exhibition needed to have an element of hopefulness. And I think sometimes exhibitions that are grappling with these issues can feel very overwhelming, and people can leave them feeling utterly disempowered. So there were ideas around access and generosity, and how we not only took care with each individual work coming into the midst at various stages of development and production, but also how we connected them together. There's this very beautiful floor sheet. Mine's folded up, but they're there on the stage as you come in, which really dives into each of the works. And there was a discussion that maybe we should just leave it at that and not have any labels or texts or didactics in the gallery itself. But Stuart, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how we came to this idea around these kind of gently leaning offerings that in many respects offer the same sort of material and depth that the floor sheet does, but also even thinking about the fact that we had lighting levels to deal with, disparate sound works, as well as wanting to kind of even put the typeface in a really legible, large form so that people could read them quite easily.
Yeah. So there were a handful of things there. I guess, continuing from the finding our way with the algae vinyl. There were also a lot of the other elements of the exhibition design kind of evolved as well. There was an early idea that rather than putting vinyl, we could utilize a technique that I'd seen elsewhere that was screen printing. You make up screens and you screen print directly onto the walls, and it's this really beautiful kind of crisp finish. And we were going to use waste inks from the screen printer to print this this kind of rainbow effect of whatever colours we kind of found in the corner at the screen printer. And we discovered, through trying to do that there's not really the expertise to do that here, but also the people that we spoke to kind of pointed to, the kind of emulsions that and the chemical footprint that you would generate by doing that much kind of screen printing in a place like this. And so okay, that's not a good idea then. And then there was another kind of there was a legacy idea from a sort of earlier discussion about looking basically in the basement here, because any exhibition space that's had any kind of history has used a lot of materials, and really that's part of the proposition of this show as to how to think about the things we make more consciously. And exhibition making has, we were just talking about it just before here, there's kind of, in some ways, kind of great efficiency of bringing people together rather than people trying to travel all around to see works, but also there's great kind of material footprint in making an exhibition usually. And, to the credit of the team here, there's reuse is kind of is thought about and kind of embedded here, but there is, still a catalogue of stuff downstairs that's sort of waiting for that kind of reuse. And so the thing that we wanted to do here is kind of deliberately really expose that, kind of bring them out, print on them, and use them as this diverse range of materials, less diverse than actually exists downstairs. But we wanted there to be some visual consistency as we went around. So there was a choice of different kinds of timbers, different kinds of cardboard, different kinds of MDF and particle board, occasional differences in these sort of felt acoustic panels that are the introductions, the occasional bit of shiny bling that sort of pops out of a corner here and there. But we made these kind of, in the end, these odd, delightful clusters of materials that seem to tell a little bit of a kind of history of this place, and also wore on their sleeve what they were doing as part of the show.
Which really brings me a little bit back to this idea of care, because Jessie, I'm going to ask you in a moment to just reflect on the paintings themselves and the movement through the robotic mechanisms. But just before we talk about that, I do want to say that this is only possible when you have a team that's all working together. And what I would say is that one of the delights about working in this context, or one of the real opportunities, I should say, about working in this context, is working with the production team. I know we've got Eric North here today and Tim Mason, the whole team, and also Lisa and Julia and their team, is that we're kind of all in it together. And perhaps unlike a more, not all galleries and museums work like this now, but perhaps more than a traditional slowness of a more museological context where one department does something, then passes it on to the next department, then it passes on to the next department, the labels get written, the exhibition design gets done, and they're really separate conversations. Here there is this overlapping, sometimes very intense, and sometimes very challenging, but also this incredible commitment by the team here, Eric and the team, to really test these ideas within often very limited means. And certainly that's true of, it looks very beautiful and very kind of simple on the walls, but actually the intent of being able to catalogue that material, cut it very quickly, work with the production people to turn it around. And then Jessie, I'm going to talk to some of the other works in a minute, but I particularly want to focus on the algae paintings because these works in this space had a real opportunity for you to, again, test how they would work with the robotic devices. Can you talk a little bit about, A, why that was important, and B, your kind of relationship with the crew in terms of testing that and making it happen?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One thing that is really evident here is that the team is absolutely incredible. Simon in particular and Eric and Tim spent so much time working with these. So at the very top of each of the panels, you'll see a little kind of bit, and that's a robot that was made by an artist named Michael Candy. And one of the other challenges is that he has moved to Slovenia now. So he hasn't been here, and Simon in particular has been doing what he would love to be doing if he was here, which is to tinker with these. They're custom-made robots. Basically, I said to Michael, I want to be able to move them up and down, which seems really simple, but it's tricky to do. So he designed these very elegant systems where there's a rod and some robotic drivers, and they do that. But the robots misbehave at times, and a couple of them did continue to lever up, and they're actually quite powerful motors in them, as Michael has told me. So they did kind of get past their little safety bits and had to be fixed. So we're not running them the whole time because we're scared that they're going to continue to wind themselves up past their point. And Michael being so far away, he's not here to fix them. So.
Yes, very inconveniently moved to Slovenia. But actually, it has been, again, a really good process. And Simon particularly has been working on this with Jessie. And we did, anyone who was here at opening night, you would have seen them move up and down. So again, the opportunity to test things in the real with public audiences, in an exchange with public audiences that exposes that thinking. And there is a program around them, so you will get to see them move throughout the life of the exhibition. We've worked out that the red one misbehaves a bit more than the others. So again, these kind of materials and their mechanisms around them seem to have their own life. I do want to just quickly talk about some of the other works. I'm not going to go through each of the works today. The purpose for this talk is more about the making of the exhibition. And there's an incredible program over 20 events over the next 8 weeks, of which you can dive more deeply into each of the individual works. But I do want to talk about, particularly, Jessie, it'd be great to get your reflections on the context of these 3 works at the front with your own work. And it was very important for us as the curatorium to really foreground Indigenous knowledges as being absolutely central to this movement towards a planetary commons. Clearly, learning and listening deeply to Indigenous elders and communities is key to that thinking. And again, we've spoken about that in depth through the lecture at the Capitol the other night and throughout this exhibition. These 3 works in the beginning are all, again, in different modes, perhaps, of what we're loosely calling modes of address. We were so fortunate to work with Vicky Cousins with this wonderful work at the front, Earth Dance, which really brings our attention to the connection between sea country and sky country and earth country as being absolutely interlinked. And what's really important again is that these works are artworks within themselves, which you can come and see in the gallery, but really importantly, it's about the conversations. So that conversations for Planetary Commons is absolutely key to this exhibition. So the programs are equal to the exhibitable works in terms of exchange, and there to draw out those conversations in more depth. So with Vicky, there'll be a discussion at the Capitol, which is called To Follow the Old Ways, which really looks at her work, particularly with her community and her daughter around the Southern Ocean Protection Embassy Collective. So thinking about particularly whale songlines. So again, these works as a platform for those bigger conversations, like your own, Jessie. Then this work over here by Sarah Lynn Rees with Mark Jakes from Open Work and Icon Science speaks to, again, like Jessie's work, that ability to test things that are kind of prototypical. So this work, called Post Infrastructure, is actually a work that's a live prototype for a current project in development in the city of Melbourne. This project can't be named at this point, so what's even more exciting is that this might actually prompt the furthering of this project and the research around it. And it's really looking on the speculation of this construction as a multivalent tree. So the idea that these kind of tree-like poles could be deployed around the city alongside real trees and support a habitat while those trees are growing. And these little boxes that you can see on these forms are habitat boxes. So they can be installed and also adapted to different types of species. And then also, obviously they're analogue, but then they can be supported through digital means, through sensors and cameras that can track how species are interacting with these poles, and the habitat boxes supporting the trees that are growing up around them in the city of Melbourne, and they can be tuned and further developed. So these 2 works, along with Dean Cross's work here, which is actually, again, an invited artwork, and Dean's work is just this beautiful performance of his country and this waterhole where he's performing and rubbing his body with the clay that used to be extracted from that waterhole to make clay bricks, and is now a thriving ecosystem once again. So again, this idea of learning from Indigenous knowledges. So it was really important, I think, that this work was foregrounded at the very front of the exhibition, and alongside, Jessie, your own work, and in terms of that kind of mode of invited works, existing artworks, but also works in process. Did you want to comment a little bit on that at all, how you found those connections and that process for you?
Yeah, so the work here is called To Sow the Wind and Reap the Whirlwind, and it's a kind of historical idiom which speaks to consequences of I guess what I'm thinking about is the use of natural resources. So we've obviously we've been using natural resources as a Western culture far beyond what we should and far beyond what's sustainable. So I think I guess, particularly as an Australian, someone that is living on someone else's country, being particularly mindful of what we're using and how we're using it, and again that idea of things that we're using once and I guess throwing away and then not really having much responsibility of after that. So I think it's been particularly nice to be surrounded by these works that also speak to the natural world and to these kind of systems that we do live within and that we need to respect more. The movement was intended to kind of, I guess, replicate these natural cycles. It will still do that. Sometimes things move slower, but yeah, I think there's a change in composition that you will see as the show goes on. They'll move and change positions. So yeah, I think we're thinking about this change of how we need to change how we live, but also that things have changed in the past and can change in the future.
I also just wanted to quickly touch on this work right behind us here, which is actually two works that have come together. And again, through the process of making the exhibition and speaking with all of the creative practitioners and architects and designers, what became really apparent, as it did with you, Jessie and Stuart, through the algae work in the graphics, was where there were opportunities to perhaps bring people who had responded to the show. There was an expression of interest within the university to be involved in the show, and we had a tremendous response. So, but again, given this really short development time, where were there opportunities for those overlaps? So this work behind us really speaks really clearly to that opportunity. It's called Mongrel Assemblies and Quarry TV Broadcast. And Caitlin Parry and Helen Duong from Mongrel Assemblies came together with these other projects we do together, Millie Catlin and Joseph Norster. And what you can see here is a structure that's constructed out of materials from the NGV architecture pavilion. And in a kind of gesture almost of reverse patronage or kind of care, these are the projects we do together, Millie and Joe. They have a quarry that they're slowly working with and rehabilitating, kind of using as a research project very slowly in the Otways. And they take these materials that the NGV work with them on, and they take the materials back to the quarry and they care for these materials. They take them apart and they bring them back to forms where they can be reused. So for us, it was really interesting, not only the quarry project itself as a kind of ecology that they're caring for, but also this material care. So the structure, as I said, is constructed out of parts of those former pavilions. There's about 4 different pavilions in this structure behind us. And then what was really exciting was Caitlin Parry, who came on board with Helen. Their project not only designed and documented the structure itself, but also brought together an NFT platform around how these materials could be most efficiently reused for other purposes, but also, really importantly, how they could be shared more efficiently. Because I guess just like us, we found material at the bottom of this very building, but how do you come into contact with these materials? So their project also includes an expression of interest, of which anyone coming into the exhibition can put in an expression of interest to have some of those materials, to take them, to reuse them, and for that to be upscaled in terms of its impact. So again, these projects are really important in terms of bringing people together to amplify that research and work. It brings me we're almost getting to the point where we're going to open up to the floor. But before we do, Stuart, you were involved in a work that is in the next gallery. And when we wrap the talk after questions, we'll go into the next gallery and we can talk a little bit more about this work by machine listening. So machine listening is Joel Stern, who I mentioned before, with James Parker and Sean Dockeray. And their work is Environments 12. And Environments 12 was a very popular series of vinyls and sound works from, I think, 69 to 79, if I'm right. And this work is a speculative next album for that series. And it really captures field recordings from an imagined future world, a kind of series of fables, if you like, where the environment itself has been updated and where things such as loudspeakers and microphones are laced through the environment and biosphere along with natural systems. So I just want to ask Stuart a little bit about that collaboration, because part of the collaboration included a record sleeve, or a vinyl sleeve, which has these really beautiful liner notes. And I'd encourage you all, it's about 34 minutes in duration, so you need some time, but to read through those liner notes that take you through these fables. Can you tell us a little bit more about your collaboration on that work?
Sure, yeah. I brought one from the other room. And so basically this is like a record sleeve. Shortly they'll make cut a record of the work, which will go into these. That'll be sort of a next iteration of the work. But basically environments 1 to 11 were the records from 69 to 79, and basically they were the first one was like really a first kind of popular experiment in bringing field recordings into like people's lounge rooms and having like the sound of an ocean play while you were having a dinner party, or it sounds very much like the 70s, doesn't it? But and so there are 11 of these, and their speculative sort of basis for this project is kind of like it starts from there and it goes through other uses of soundscapes in other situations, like the design of sound environments in zoos for the benefit of animals, and through to a new kind of emerging science called acoustic enrichment, and there's a photograph on this version of the cover, where up to a certain point the sounds of a healthy reef can be played to a degraded reef and help heal that reef. So, which sounds like science fiction, but basically, like blending those ideas, their idea also through making, they wrote this series of scenarios and made this sound work with like AI generated like clones of these voice actors, and made this work that takes you through a kind of series of these scenarios and situations. The liner note, so this is the other version, which is an Environments 12 with Environments 1 on its cover. But basically, there are 10 kind of different versions of the possible record over there at the moment. The liner notes, like take you through a series of these scenes, and I guess the idea with we worked through again a lot of versions of this, but the idea in the end was to stick reasonably closely to the kind of visual language of the original records, but take them into somewhere else through the way we made it and the inclusion of this kind of strange cacophony of diagrams on the reverse.
I think and there is such a wonderful connection between Joel's work and these kind of incredible fables, and then also Piero's work with urchin corals, which is also working at the very forefront of coral rejuvenation, and particularly through these self-seeding pods. So one coming from very much a kind of research perspective, and Joel's work also deeply embedded in research, but also from a kind of more poetic and artistic perspective. So I think that's a really good point to open it up to some questions, if there's any from the floor.
Actual plastics have a terrible long life. I'm wondering, in various circumstances, do these automatically degrade, or is there a set of, ways that they will last?
Yeah. So they can. I actually wanted to talk about the plastic to begin with, because in my research, what I've found is that the timeline that's given for a lot of petrochemical plastics about how long they will last is actually based on how long it will take an organism to evolve to degrade them, not for them to degrade. So we already have some, we're kind of ahead of the timeline, some wax moths, and there are some other the bacterias that have already started to evolve, but the volume that we have created is too big. On this material, I was just thinking about how deep to go. On a molecular level, it's a more simple molecular structure for the polymer, and so it can be degraded much more readily than those petrochemicals. It is actually degrades more readily than some other kind of commonly used bioplastics, so the PLAs or the polylactic acid starch ones. This will degrade faster than those, so the molecules will kind of unknit faster. It is controllable. They can be kept. The main thing that degrades it is hydrolysis. So, not a surprise. The thing that is the catalyst for it to actually become a liquid again and to be reused is the thing that degrades it the most. So to find that out, we did some spectra scans, which look at all the molecules, how they're changing and what bonds are changing over time. So we tested a lot of different samples that had been aged differently. The other thing that happens with plastics, and it happens with all plastics, is that the additives that are added to control how malleable they are tend to migrate. So the plasticizers will migrate. I use a vegetable plasticizer, and it does migrate. So probably around a 5-year is how long it will be stable if it's kind of kept. But that's also how long I've been making them. So the testing is ongoing. But yeah, that's what this experimental thing is about.
We're doing a test right now by having the vinyl on the outside of the glass.
Yes, and we have had a few discussions in terms of what we do, in terms of its durability. Do we replace them? Do we let them degrade? All of those aspects of testing this in real time. And obviously, as the exhibition closes, that material will all go back to Jessie, and it can be reused and circulated. And these kind of exhibition panels will all go back into the school. They can be used in their current form and simply flipped over, or reused for materials for teaching and learning purposes or research. Any other questions? Kenzie?
Thanks very much for the discussion. And you've just sort of partially answered the question that I was going to ask. And it's really wonderful to see like a different approach to exhibition making with, particularly with exhibition texts and that kind of thing. But I'm just wondering, and there might not be an answer to this, it's something that I'm thinking through. How do you continue to make exhibitions, and especially exhibition furniture, build walls, that kind of thing? How do you translate or transfer this approach from this exhibition to future exhibitions? having worked in institutions myself, like maybe one exhibition will have a real sustainable focus, and then the next exhibition sort of undoes all that work. Is there a way to kind of, I don't know, make exhibitions sustainably?
Yeah, you've beautifully kind of prefaced my closing comments, because I think that is absolutely the challenge. And I would say really clearly that we're also really aware that there's still a lot of, there's lighting, there's power, there's video, there's all of those kind of aspects of a footprint. So I guess the challenge is, in a space such as this, which is a challenging space on a number of levels, both in terms of its spatial qualities and its accessibility. This is a hard building sometimes to cross over the threshold, particularly for public audiences. They can feel like this is a space that's not for them. So one of the things I think over many years that everyone in this gallery team has struggled with is, how do you create a space of encounter? And that kind of space of encounter for these works or programs is really important. But also, how do you do that with very limited means? In the past, that's sometimes been budgetary means, but now is actually about being mindful and thoughtful, particularly, again, in budgetary constraints, but more importantly, with the practitioners around us who are all committed to a different form of exhibition making. So, I mean, pretty much things like all of these platforms are reused in this case, and Eric and Simon and Tim and the whole team have a pretty comprehensive kit now, of which they share not only within this gallery but across the institution and also other institutions, so that we stop, if we can, producing more and more material. So that's a really important aspect of it. The other thing I would say is, and we were talking about this as we started the conversation today, is how we start to think in a more distributed way, as not only a city in Melbourne, but a region and nationally. So how perhaps we all stop making individual exhibitions and how we might share them, and think about how other people access them in different ways to, again, use that time and material and resource really effectively. And also freight is a big thing. There's no overseas or international freight in this exhibition. There's very, very minimal transport. Most of it, I think, was Eric picking things up or Boom, but just thinking through things like that. And flights is another thing for anyone international. That's obviously something we've all got to get our head around. It's really wonderful to have those personal connections and to have people come into the country and have those abilities for exchange. Sometimes it's vital, and other times maybe it's not so vital, and we can do it remotely. But I think on that note, I would like to just say thank you to you all for being here today on a Friday lunchtime. And thank you to Stuart and Jessie for so generously sharing the process and exposing some of the challenges as well as the opportunities. Thank you to Lisa and the program team at RMIT Culture. And of course, again, to Eric North and his team, who are all part of RMIT Culture. And just to finally say, this is part of the Now or Never program. But we do have 8 weeks duration for this show, so lots of really fantastic programs on, I think there's over 20 in all. So thanks very much for being here. I invite you informally, as we finish today, to come into the next gallery, and we'll be around to talk through any of the works for at least the next kind of half an hour, should you want to have more of a conversation. Thanks so much.